I wanted to thank everybody for coming this morning, especially given the reschedule. It is such a distinct pleasure for me personally, and I know for many of you who have been in fandom for a very long time and who love the art of comic books, to have with us today what I consider the Dean of DC Science Fiction Art, Mr. Murphy Anderson. I hope you join me in giving him a round. I wanted to start today. Can everyone hear okay?
Yeah, Gary, close to the mic.
Stay close to the mic. Or as they say in the band world, eat the mic.
Eat the mic.
Eat the mic, okay.
You want this one clear?
Back in '92, I wrote the following paragraph as a preface to a Murphy Anderson interview, and I wanted to read it today because I think it provides a good foundation and introduction to what we're here to talk about. Interviewer's note. When I first began purchasing DC Comics from the newsstand during the middle 1950s, I noticed that several artists seemed to centrally define the DC look. I loved the exquisite inking detail of Russ Heath. I was enthralled over the dynamic lines of Joe Kubert. I wondered at the futuristic cities of Carmen Infantino. The clean, nearly photographic style of Gil Kane took my breath away. But for me, one artist's work was the most compelling. That artist was the great Murphy Anderson. Even now, when I stare at the original Atomic Knights art page hanging in my den, I never failed to marvel at the unbelievable level of detail in each beautifully rendered panel. I'm still in awe of the intricacy of line, the placement of shadow, and the truly superb composition of the total page. I'm sorry, I'm tearing up a little bit here. For me, Murphy Anderson's work is the apex of the Silver Age. From the first time I ever journeyed through the pages of Strange Adventures in Mystery and Space to this very day, Murphy Anderson continues to be far and away my personal favorite. But beyond his immeasurable contribution to comics, I learned something else about Murphy that he himself would not tell you. Even with all the recent media attention and notoriety, amazingly, Murphy Anderson continues to be soft-spoken, humble, and anxious to make sure everyone else gets their fair share of credit. I have found this to be a rare quality among many comic book creators. At the age of 10, I loved Murphy Anderson for his work. At the age of 43, I deeply appreciate him for who he is. Gary Carter, April 3rd, 1992. And given that, now Gary Carter at the age of 63 has the unbelievable privilege to be up here on this dais one more time with Murphy Anderson. So Murphy, let's get started.
Okay.
One of the places that I know is of meaning in your life timeline is growing up, the influence of your mother, and especially the early influence of several artists. And I wonder if you talk about that a little bit.
Well, I always liked the comics, funny papers in those days. Before most of the newsstands were covered with comic books. I devoured them, and my mother helped me to learn to read. She was a teacher before she got married. So I've often running, I guess you'd say.
Murphy, gotta get closer. I must have filmed dozens of your panels over the years. That
Okay.
deep, wonderful voice of yours does not carry.
Okay.
Just boosted him up a little bit more.
All right. Oh dear, I'm gonna have
It's,
to.
it's like attacking a microphone now. Sorry. Yes, he's right. That's actually, just take off his hand.
Oh,
Hold his hand.
okay.
There you go.
That better?
Yeah. Fine.
So you were saying about your mom teaching you to read?
Right, right. And then I got her off her back. I mean, me off her back.
And then you noticed things on the newsstand.
Right, and I noticed the out-of-town newspapers, especially the Daily News and some out of Philadelphia and all. Daily News and the Mirror. the tabloid size was just right for Buck Project pages, Tarzan and what have you. And I was a big fan of Tarzan and Buck Rogers.
Who were some early favorite comic book artists?
Oh, my favorite comic book artists were very quickly Will Eisner and Lou Fine. Lou was a great artist, but he was not too much in the managerial side and plotting and what have you, but Will was. And Will's ideas were just great. He really was, I think, the greatest impact on comic books in those days.
Was there any specific stylistic devices that influenced you the most of either Eisner or Fine?
Well, yes, they were both realistic, but they were, unrealistic enough to make the comic books work. All right.
Okay. So then you decided to become an artist at some point in your life. How old were you when you made that decision?
Oh, I think at the time I was 10 or 11 years old. I think along those lines. A couple of magazines, the boys' magazines, the Open Road for Boys and such, had contests and all, and it gave you a chance to enter their contests and so forth.
Do you by any chance recall where your first published piece ended up?
I'm really not sure. The local paper did print some of my work. And the club they had, the weekly club and one of the newspapers. And I would always send stuff into it, and they usually printed it.
When did you eventually go to art school, and where did you go?
Well, I, of course, went to art classes in high school, junior high, and even at Carolina, the couple of quarters that I was there, I studied some under William E. Prince, who was I liked his work very much. He was a very good, nice guy to talk with.
Was he an illustrator
He was
primarily?
an illustrator, but he did a comic strip for a time about a boy and his adventures. I forget now the whole thrust of it.
So how long were you in art school?
Well, at Carolina, only 2 quarters. So I've been to New York, sent our school newspaper to the name is escaping me now, but there was I think it was in second. Well, anyhow, for the Columbia Scholastic Press Association. And my fellow editor, we were co-editors in our senior year of the Greensboro High Life newspaper. It was published every 2 weeks. 8-page.
When you were with CSPA, did you publish anything that you still recall as being particularly proud of or of note?
Well, yeah, I made comments on the war and different things, did editorial cartoons, plus some illustrations, little pictures to scatter throughout the paper and sports events.
Well, I'm thinking that that would have probably been in sometime between 35 and 37, about that.
No, that was earlier, but 42,
43, okay. So then how did you, well, first of all, I guess the war got in the way, right?
Right, I had turned 18 and before I was 18, I came to New York and I had a job with Fiction House for several months
Okay.
until I had to go back and register for the draft.
During those early years at Fiction House, do you recall what particular strips that you were assigned to?
Oh, Fiction House, the Star Pirate was my first. And then I worked on a lot of other things. And they let me do filler pages, anything that I came up with.
Did you pencil for or ink over anybody that was a particular note back then?
At that point in time, I was penciling and inking them out and stuff.
Okay.
And I did occasionally help out, as I recall, with Dan recollections, maybe helping someone get a job out at the last minute. Working staff, in which I was as assistant staff writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I met Ruben Rivera,
Mm-hmm.
and who was a big Kadif guy? Let's just keep it.
As I recall, Ruben Herrera ended up doing quite a bit of things for House of Mystery in the 50s.
Well, he did the tourism comic strip at that time. He was doing it. It really was fascinating for me to talk to him.
Ruben Herrera was actually visited a couple of San Diego cons in the 70s, so I got a chance to meet him. What an amazing guy.
Oh, yeah.
Well, so then the war took over, and did you do any work during the war?
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, Fiction House sent me work while I was in boot camp. And they made me part of the office crew in my company. And I was able to get some drawing. And between some of the boot pushers were very understanding and let me work on in my artwork.
That's amazing. I think we had some, if you move forward a little bit, a couple of slides, I believe I remember there was a Star Pirates, a couple of pages
Yeah,
here.
that's one.
And I can see the later Murphy Anderson of the 50s leaking through some of this work, some of your stylistic.
Well, I was highly influenced by old time, old life, and
Go to the next one. I can start to see some of the distinctive Murphy Anderson look with the crow's feet and that facial expression.
well, I guess I robbed that from whoever I could.
Yeah, that's really amazing.
Well, I don't remember the story exactly. I remember who it was.
Well, I know that as a young lad, I was appreciative of the way you drew women's legs. Go to the next one, if you would. Would you hold on that one for a minute? This one is a particularly compelling visual from the early years at Fiction House. Really beautiful work. Just let that stay there. What else do you remember about your days at Fiction House besides working while you were in the Army to complete the tasks?
Oh, nothing much to say that party staff was something and we
That's all right.
I know the name, but they escape me now.
That's all right. Did Fiction House provide a stepping stone to meeting other people and other particular publishing groups?
No,
And so, at what point during or past the war did you stay with Fiction House even past World War
oh
II?
yeah, I had worked with them up to about 1952.
Okay, so you were still with Fiction House immediately following the war and on?
Yeah, well, they had work for me whenever.
Did you get any work published in any other areas while you were still with Fiction House?
Oh, the school newspapers and that sort of thing.
Uh-huh. You mean the Scholastic?
Yeah, well, Carolina, they had a magazine.
Mhm.
I got to know the editorial people there.
I'm keeping track of your age as we go here, so I know you were born in 26, so 10 years old and 36. And if you think about being 10 years old in 1936 relative to comic books and the emerging comic book market that was coming out on the stands.
Well, yeah, I was aware of the comics and it was much later in the early 40s to the time I actually got to work.
So you were 20 in 46 1 year after the war,
Right.
and still working for Fiction House until the early 50s.
Well, about that time, Helen met my wife in Chicago. I decided to try Chicago longer.
Okay. Could you tell us how you met your wife? This nice lady
Well,
sitting out there in the audience.
I stopped down at the serviceman center on Michigan Boulevard. One of the later hotels had young ladies that fighter from the high schools and what have you to come and run the head checks and that kind of thing. And that's how I met her. She checked my hat, and I had to go back and make sure it was being taken good care of. And it was.
And was it being taken good care of?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, she was able to call her mother and talk her into letting me take her home that night.
So you took her home that night?
Right, and I met her family.
Uh-huh. That sounds nice. Well, what year were you married?
And 48,
48. So how long was the courtship?
about 43, 48 years.
Okay. And since she's still here now, I'm assuming you're still married.
Oh, I'm very lucky.
That's right. So if you guys will help me do the math, let's see, 48 to the present, how many years is there?
64.
64 years in a row. That's amazing. No pun intended. That's amazing.
That's
So,
fantastic too.
for all you Ziff Davis fans, that was two good zingers in a row there. So here we are now. We've turned the corner of the early 50s. It's about 51, 52, and you're coming to the end of your time with Fiction House. Then what happened?
Well, somewhere along the line, I got involved with, since I lived in Chicago, I'll get off the beaten track a little bit. I kept watching the ads to see if anyone needed an artist. And I saw one that sounded pretty good. I answered the ad, and I was sitting in an old office in the Hearst building in Chicago. And about 8 or 10 other guys were sitting around too, waiting to answer the ad. And it turned out that they were looking, they didn't tell us that at that time, but they were looking for a substitute for Rick Yeager and Dick Calkins on Buck Rogers. And that's how I wound up with them, and was hired a little later to do the Daily Bucks. And usually 3 or 4 years later, they also, when Rick Yeager was retiring, they did the Sunday Page also.
So you really started to meet some heavyweights in the strip world.
Right.
Perhaps you could share with the folks here the difference in the pecking order between working on Sunday Pages at that time and working on comic books.
Well, that was, I don't know that the money was much better, but it was still a lot more received by the public.
We would always hear from artists that many of the comic book artists, that their dream was really to work for the Sunday Pages, not really the comic books.
Right. That was my aspiration to do newspaper comics, since I had a high school newspaper background.
So about this time, unbeknownst to you, Julie Swartz started working for DC in those early days. And how did you eventually get connected to DC in the 50s?
Well, I had moved back to New York at that time. My wife and I were married, and we moved to New York. Had an apartment in Bayside, New York, and I started to commute in and shared space with Dan Barry and his brother. They had an extra slot and let me work with them. I didn't work with them, but just had a place to hang my hat and get calls and so forth. But I was working for Fiction House still, and then Ziff Davis came along, and Jerry Siegel was hired to head up their comic book division. They started that at that point in time. And I met Jerry and I worked an awful lot with him after that.
What kind of a guy was Jerry Siegel?
Oh, very nice guy. Very understanding, and we hit it off. He was a big science fiction nut, of course. And we both knew a lot of the same people.
So then how did the actual connection to DC occur?
Oh, I was waiting for a page, and one day I turned in some more kids that they were sent. It was for Jerry. He said, Murphy, I'm sorry the freelancer didn't bring the writing and get the pages in. And you'll have to come back tomorrow. And that scared me.
Well, actually, Julie occasionally could be a little pointed in his conversations. But anyway, so do you remember some of the early work that you started to do for DC? This would have been middle 50s, right?
Yeah, the early 50s. I started out, I'm trying to think now. I did a couple of color pages, I believe, but I just did stories, not about any new character, and Planet Comics and Wings Comics, and occasionally I did some work with Planet Comics.
Of course,
One other thing, Fiction House had they were big on pulp magazines, and I was able to meet the pulp editors, and I did a lot of pulp illustrations over the years for their science fiction and their sports magazines.
and I wanted to share with you that I've spent many, many, many hours in old shops looking through pulps, trying to find Murphy Anderson illustrations inside of pulps.
Not too many, not.
Well, they're hard to find. So I'm going to put out the word. If anybody knows of that, please let me know later. Most of the people in this room, I'm willing to bet, are aware of your work, at least early on, through the Strange Adventures and Mystery in Space titles for DC. As you look back on those titles, what are some of your favorite recollections?
I enjoyed the space stuff especially. I had a lot of freedom on. And Gardner Fox was writing most of them, and John Broome between them.
I know for many of us here who used to write in and get 3 copies through the mail from Julie if we wrote a letter good enough to be published or was clever enough. We often would get sometimes a letter back and said, here you go, and by the way, and then they would take a piece of art, and because they were a bit thrifty at DC in those days, they would often take the art and fold it into fourths to make it fit into the manila envelope. Did any of you ever receive one of those? Sometimes it happens, and so sometimes you'll see people who have pieces of original art that's been folded twice so it fits into a manila envelope. And you can imagine, even my young brain, the horror I felt when I opened that up and saw that the artwork had been folded. But that's a whole nother story. Atomic Knights continues to become more and more famous with each passing year, and many people describe it as one of your high watermarks at DC. How do you look back on the Atomic Knights?
I enjoyed it very much, and we talked it out, Julie and I, and John would go to lunch together, and we figured out what it would be about. It's in the post-war, post-nuclear war in the United States. And they had to wear the uniform because they found that that would shield them from radiation. They were almost everywhere. And I think in New Orleans they were radiation free.
I have here, I believe, the only Strange Adventures in which your strip made the cover.
Yeah.
This is the Strange Adventures 144. Does anyone recall? How many people are Strange Adventures collectors? Yeah, I'm sure. Your original, see? They know. But I remember going to the stands and almost jumping for joy when I saw Atomic Nights actually on the cover of the magazine. It was a wonderful thing.
That was unusual that they allowed it.
Yeah.
That you would
And
finally went in and talked to Jack Byrne.
they let you do it. I remember my brother was standing next to me, my younger brother, and he said, "Nice moles." Nice moles. And we thought that was wonderful. I just wondered if anybody, if you think about this particular strip from Murphy, how complicated it must have been to draw these particular Knights outfits, the Knights armor, many times over, panel by panel, in different configurations and positions. And as a kid, I didn't understand that, and then the further complication of giant Dalmatian dogs with random spots that had to be done every time the dog changed position in a panel. I mean, we are talking masterful art here. This is really something special. Here's another Strange Adventures cover. Do you remember this one?
Oh, yeah.
145. The reason this is notable is because there aren't very many artists who can render glass or the look of glass correctly in a comic book, especially on a cover. For those of you who are art students, you know that glass is right up there with wind and water as being difficult to illustrate. And this one has a lot of glass, especially this thing right there. So that's a kind of something that's interesting.
Look at the back covers of a couple of these. No, not that one. I did a series of covers for them, and that may be one there that did some existing art. That wasn't the one. Oh, that one is one of mine.
Right, the model.
Yeah, that I illustrated the models, the Aurora models.
Yeah.
And thank goodness we had this book with us today.
Will you be handing them out after the
I brought samples for everyone. And it only cost me $140,000. Well, I also brought this page, which I wanted to show you, which is the cover, The Strange Adventures 138. And
that's out of the museum.
yeah, and
Museum
what,
of Modern
do
Art,
you
I think.
recall anything? Did you actually go to the New York Museum of Modern Art to be inspired?
Yeah. The Museum of Modern Art was an inspiration, but I didn't do much work on their subject matter. But they were half a block from Fiction House. So I was open.
It's an easy walk. For those of you who've been to that museum, actually it's amazing how much of the background of this piece looks just like the area that discusses the dinosaurs at that museum. And I am...
changed in all these years?
Have any of you been there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you can see that inspiration.
Well, they were in the library of one museum, I think. Not library, but up on Fifth Avenue. And, but the one I'm talking about was on 52nd Street, just off Fifth and 25th and 6th.
I've been there myself one time to see what you told me 20 years ago when I went to look, when I was visiting Sotheby's. I also wanted to point out that when you look at many of the other comic book companies and even some of the other artists at DC, that imagine that this cover was set up in a way that would economize the amount of work that went into it. What they would have done is they would have just had the head of the dinosaur skeleton coming into the panel and probably one human figure. In the Stan Lee style, it would have said, i.e., is it accursed, it will destroy us, or it's impossible, it can't be, or something like that. But there would have been just one figure, right? And if you look, this is a deceptively complex cover. When you look at all of the detail of the bones in the dinosaur and the fact that the vast majority of it is rendered, and the fact that the angle of the dinosaur is moving away, which means the perspective comes into play. And I don't want to make this an art lesson today, but I can just tell you that the arrangement of this particular front cover is masterful work. It is absolutely masterful work. The amount of detail, et cetera, the number of characters, the placement of the characters, even the relationship of the scene to the logo and the title is pretty amazing work. And this was just one of hundreds of covers that Murphy did over his time at DC. So, bravo to you, Murphy.
If you want to go,
What a great piece of work.
please around.
I was almost sorry to see the thought balloon get in the way of me seeing what was behind it.
Were you? I mean, were they really last-minute assignments for you, ignoring the rest? Did Julie really just drop them on you
Well,
very quickly?
Generally speaking, the covers were like that. There's not many were done well in advance.
Okay.
But they asked me to come in and work on their premises, which I did a lot of the time.
Right.
And when someone would come in, Mark Leidinger might need some help, or Jack Schiff might need some help, you know, on the cover with whatever problem, they'd call me in and ask me to ink it or fix this or fix that to suit their editorial qualifications.
See, because that was also, I mean, Julie would start off often before plotting the stories with the writers with the cover idea.
Right.
So, I mean, almost it seems counterintuitive to the way they were working back then, than just, you know, than what Julie said about dropping the covers on you last minute and having you do them. That was
Well,
okay.
fairly often that did happen.
Yeah.
I started about afternoon and had to leave it before leaving the premises,
Yeah.
which was not a very difficult thing, but there were little problems with some of the artwork having to be moved around and so forth. But we got it done. Yeah. That's a little, I know we're working on it, but
Was that a character that, you know, you had wanted to do in the past?
oh yeah, I was very much aware of John Carter, who he was and all, and he, in effect, was the beginning of a lot of superhero stuff and otherworldly stuff. As if Davis started with, well, that was just as if Davis, wasn't it, John Carter?
I know it was a syndicated strip with John Coleman Burroughs
Yeah.
for a while, and then I guess it was in comics, right? I think Jesse Marsh did it.
Yeah.
It was in comics in the 1940s for a while.
Yeah.
And then later sort of reappeared in those weird worlds. in the
Right.
early
Yeah. When
70s.
DC got the license to do all the Burroughs characters.
That's right. Any other?
Mr. Anderson, how would you compare John Carter to Gary Carter? You don't have that.
I can jump higher.
The editor was responsible for letting the other artists maybe change some of the artwork of the original guy, if that's what you're asking.
Yes.
Yeah. But that was rarely a problem. And I didn't do any editorial changes that were of any impact, I wouldn't think. Just little things had to be fixed.
Right there.
Mr. Anderson, in the early 70s, you for a couple of years, you inked a lot of Superman stories over Kurt Swan's pencil.
Right.
How was that collaboration? Can you comment on that?
Well, that
Wonderful.
I think that mainly happened when Morgan Weissner dropped off the Superman character. But up to that point, only Mort handled the Superman stuff. Anyone else that used it had to get special permission. But Jimmy Olsen and all the Superman family were handled by Mort, and very successfully. He went to California quite a bit, working on plots and different trends for the borough stuff. So it was unusual when he gave it up, but that's what happened. I answer your question, I'm not sure. Oh, I think almost everything was palatable, you know, I could work on it. They didn't insist that I have a certain effect as a rule, so I could change things a little bit if I had to. Take it home and have to do it in the middle of the night, you know, it's kind of tough to not change something you felt was very much necessary.
Actually, kind of conversely, which work did you enjoy the most or were you most proud of?
Well, I guess since I like Buck Rogers so much, that was one of the first things. And I like the science fiction material. And of course, working for Julie, a lot of the stuff, what you call Buck Rogers stuff, you know, all his science fiction. Not all, but I mean a lot of it was space opera, and I enjoyed it.
Back in the days of CBM, at one point, we had thought about doing an encyclopedia of Julie Sport's DC aliens. There was, we figured there had to be at least more than 300 that were created over the course of 30 years. Another question in the back there?
Me?
Yes.
What's the one thing you enjoyed working on the Brave and the Bold?
Well,
What's the question?
What's the one thing you like about working on the Brave and the Bold?
I don't think I worked on that or something like that.
do you recall which issue that you're
Yeah, it says volume 162, something like that.
The Black Canary.
the Black Canary?
Starman and Black Canary.
Starman and Black Canary.
Oh, the Black Canary. Well, that was two early characters at DC, and I liked them, you know, and they, Julie, and I think maybe,
Bingo.
This is it.
right.
Sports
I
minister.
think a couple of the older editors came and gave their 2 cents, more Larson, Jack Schiff, and a couple of other guys that steered those earlier comics before Julie came on board.
We have about 10 minutes to go. Another question?
Yeah, Murphy, just thinking back, when you were doing the JLA covers, you didn't care doing that stuff, did you? With all the different JLA characters?
No, it wasn't. It was kind of made them a little more complicated to do, but I enjoyed doing them anyhow. And especially when we could work out the cover to Julie's satisfaction.
Well, let me ask one other thing. Did you ever came across me Bernard Bailey at all? Bernard Bailey? Did you ever have a chance?
Yeah, I
Bernard
met
Bailey?
him. I met him, but I really,
I wonder what his reaction, I often wonder what his reaction to your work on the Spectrum would be.
I'm not really sure what his reaction was, but he had more or less gone on to other pastures, and when he left, he was always appreciated it. The editors always talked well of it.
Another question back there?
Yeah, during Jack Kirby's run on Jimmy Olsen, what I've read, were you one of the artists who had to do the retouch of Jimmy Olsen and Superman's faces?
Yeah, I did a little of that.
What was your, were there any misgivings about that?
I was a little embarrassed by it because it had been inked, some of it had been already inked by Benny Coletta perhaps, and it wasn't quite what they were looking for. And I would go back and change mostly on the faces, you know.
But you, which isn't typical, didn't you actually feel obligated? Didn't you go back to Jack Kirby and apologize to him, if I remember?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a typical Murphy Anderson gentleman thing to do. They made me do it, Jack, I'm sorry.
Question?
Yeah, Murphy, did you have a hand in designing Adam Strange's costume?
Well, in a way, yes.
Was that like Carmine's design, or did you just, do something?
Gil Kane did that first cover.
I'll tell you the truth, I'm not quite sure, because I've done characters with that country headgear before they started Adams Street. So I really don't know, and I'm not quite sure. It may have been one of the periods when I was doing some work for Ziff Davis or someone that I couldn't take a new project, Julie, and I can't really answer that one.
Yeah, seriously, though, I talked.
And so it was sold when he was working during World War II. And they had him down at Aberdeen, I think it was. And he started the whole idea of BS Magazine. And after a time, he got embroiled in other things. And I had helped him on PS when I worked on staff for him. And the people down at PS knew my work. You know, I knew them personally because I had to go down for reviews and so forth. And so I wound up getting the contract at that point in time when it was up for grabs. And I worked on it for several years.
Do you recall it, how many years approximately?
I can ask my better half, maybe she knows.
Better half? How many years did you work on PS Magazine?
Yeah.
10 years.
10 years. 10 years.
I would like to speak with you, Mr. Carter.
Okay,
About
okay.
someone has a question.
Could we get a microphone back there?
What he likes to do. I never heard not complaining about anything he has to do. He just loves to work in the department. Never complained about it.
And I just want to say thank you for going to the arduous task of coming to San Diego, traveling all the way across country to be with us. And I just want you to know that as the years continue, my appreciation for your work, and I bet everyone here will go up, that your ethos and credibility as an artist. It's my belief that in the historic look back on especially the years of the Silver Age, that your name will continue to be one of the giants of the industry.
Oh, that's very nice.
So thank you.
That's very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice. Pleasure.
Yeah.
Wonderful.